very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Now, as we continue to tell the stories of our people and their communities, we make sense of who we are and we enrich the lives of all of us. A few weeks ago, Ilambe Motley spoke of Horace King, his protector, during his days in high school, and he spoke of Horace's family, the Kings, who lived on Green Hill. Ilambe informed that I should seek out the Kings for an interview. With the guidance of Eugenia Edie, my team and I went in search of the Kings in Green Hill. The home where they lived is no longer there, but there's very good news. In Navy Garden, Christchurch, we caught up with a brother, Michael King, who kingly consented to share in his memories of Green Hill. In this, the first presentation, you will learn of the early history of his family, aspects of the social history of Green Hill, and the many activities associated with what was regarded as the epicenter in the community. Now, because Green Hill is not far away and it is without a city wall, the program begins right now. It's over to you, Mr. King.
Well, Green Hill in the 1950s and 60s was very much a rural community. Where we lived at Horace'ville was exactly 3 miles from Bridgetown. But growing up in Green Hill, as you're probably aware, I'm the youngest of 14 children, 7 boys and 7 girls. My father, Horace Arlington King, born in Nestville, St. Lucie on the 13th of January, 1900. My father worked for himself from the time he was about 16, 17 years old, when his father died in an industrial accident at Mount Gare Plantation in St. Lucie. And he had to go and find a job, first as a young apprentice blacksmith to help look after his mother and 2 younger sisters. And then family moved to the Eagle Hall area, and then he got married to my mother, and they had his 14 children. But he worked for himself, and from his home, when they moved to Green Hill in 1931, and the property was just sold 2 years ago. So we had an association with Green Hill for 89 years.
Michael King's father was an industrious man. In fact, he was one of the pioneers in the wrought iron business in Barbados. Michael lists a number of the sites around the island where his father's good work is found.
As a blacksmith and a wrought iron specialist and one of the pioneers in the area of wrought iron. And he did a lot of work for government, building handrails and gratings and that sort of stuff for the road. And any iron work, maintaining apartment buildings, used to maintain the gates and the iron works at Harrison College. I remember my foundation school had to be rebuilt after Hurricane Janet. We built a lot of the handrails and so forth on the upper stories and so forth. I don't know if some of them are still there, they might have enhanced them. And then Commerce School was built and opened in September 1958. All of the gates were built by King's Engineering Works, and all of the handrails in the school. Of course, that is now 64 years ago, so I'm sure that most of them would have been replaced. But I still see one of the old gates they're still operating in need of repair. They repaired or replaced some of them, but the major design still stayed there, you know. And so there were opportunities for us because my father was a very independent man. And his mantra to us was very simple. Put yourself in a position that you never have to ask anybody for a job. So he was so fiercely independent that it might come across to some people that his children were fairly arrogant, but no. We understood the importance of getting yourself in a position that you had options in life, because many people did not have options in life. They could not make choices. But that element of our upbringing stood us in good stead wherever we went to study or work around the world. And told us that we could compete. Nobody was better than us. And more often than not, we were better than most people. But that would be seen as arrogance. But you got to understand that my father sent children to school overseas to study at universities, colleges. Unfortunately, he died when I was 19 years old. And I was the last one who didn't have the comfort of a monthly allowance or allowance for a whole term from your father to carry you through to the end of the term or the school year. But he never once went to the bank and borrowed a penny. No, at no time in his career. He and his childhood friend, Sam Marshall, from Exteen, who had Marshall's garden, vegetable garden, and it used to be run by the Polytechnic. I don't know if it is still done, or he donated the land, or the government took him over for the Polytechnic. They're in Exteen. They always spoke about him, but he was my father's childhood friend from teenage years. And so I can still remember burying my father's body, the 7 sons and his best friend, at the foot of his coffin as we left, took it into the Westbury Cemetery. Yeah, great memories. But these were fiercely independent men who looked out for each other and made sure that they all ate. They had their own financing system, the buying equipment or whatever, but they did not depend on going to the banking system. In any case, there was a time when you had to go to some banks in Barbados. You couldn't open an account unless you had a letter of recommendation. And there was one particular bank that I was upset about. I have never invested not even a Zimbabwe penny in that bank because I just felt that that was grossly uncalled for in any society, any society. But that was Barbados in the 1950s, 60s. Things started to change more in the 70s, and I can recall we were texting Harold Barrow visiting my father every week in Hingston Gap, and then Kensington New Road before he became Premier. And I'm sure he used to find out what is going on in the city of Bridgetown. All the people in New Orleans and Emerton and so spoke about my father helping them. There were some entertainers who told me that many a day they had nothing to eat. And they would go to my father. He would send them to Mr. Harding's shop at the corner of Hingston Gap. What my father did was to keep a running tab where he had cheese and ham and bread and other things for people in the neighborhood. So if anybody needed a ham cutter, cheese cutter, the kids need to go to school. And also help in terms of some kids' school fees, school uniform, books or whatever. And you say, I will feed you, I will give you things to go to school, but if you steal anybody's money, I will lock you up. But there are many people who we never knew, who told us about the largesse of our parents and what they did, but we just figured that was the normal thing to do. But there are key elements of life in Green Hill where we were taught to respect everyone, no matter whether you were a laborer, whether you were a butcher, a carpenter, a mason, an artisan, whether you were unemployed or not. And what Green Hill was, beyond being a rural community, but it was a closely knit village with a well mix of people of all strata of life. People who could consider themselves part of a landed gentry and others who had nothing.
The landed gentry and those who had nothing will be discussed in the next episode. Let us turn our attention now to a major institution which the community, in a sense, revolved around.
Of course, the epicenter of the activities of Green Hill and the life in Green Hill was the Buxton Boys' School, later to be called the Buxton Primary School. That was a school that started about early 1920s, I think about 1920 through 24. And it closed at the end of 1980 when Eden Lodge Primary School opened in January 1981 as an amalgamation of the schools from the area, Montgomery, boys in Cave Hill, Edgy Memorial in Cave Hill for girls, Buxton Boys School. Our home ended up almost being the staff room. Many people brought their lunch and left them there, and then we prepared lunch for them, because you got to bear in mind that electricity never came to that school until about maybe 1958, 59. I remember a concert in the 1950s with the, as you said, with the gas lamps. And Joe Trula and the Mighty Charmer came and entertained the people, the folk in Green Hill. And that was a classic. I was a little boy. So a lot of the stories are over my head, but I think I understood enough, you know. So if you needed ice or water or drinks, I can still see the beaded pitchers going over to the school with ice and water too. One for the headmaster, one for the staff, and so forth. A lot of children ate lunch in our house. I remember Glenn Murray writing about and talking about it at his book launch.
Interestingly enough, in the background is the music coming from the Church of the Resurrection, a major institution here on Green Hill. Now, that sent me to the book, Barbados, Customs to Treasure, Early Gems of Bajan Creativity by Glenn Murray. On page 77 of that book, I stayed there for a while until other friends informed me of the fabulous experience they regularly had attending Buxton Boys School in Green Hill, including being able to pick the fruit of the several ackee, golden apple and mango trees that were to be found along the school route. I was to stay at the Buxton Boys School until my mother quite wisely decided to have me transferred to St. Giles Boys School, where my brother taught and where he could and would keep an extremely keen eye on me.
Glenn Murray came up from Spoonersville before he went to St. Giles the last year or two, when his brother Ver, who lives in the Bahamas, was teaching there. Ver, late James Algernon, Motley, and my brother Neville, the three of them were running mates all through life, from Green Hill and Spoonersville, Dales, etc. A small little lunchroom was added to the school in the mid-50s, just around the time of Hurricane Janet, I think. And that was used for milk and biscuits for the little break. And believe you me, there were some kids, that's all they had in the morning. They didn't have breakfast. They had to think about breakfast. Because Barbados, you know, we had a lot of people who were not able to provide well for their children, but with great dignity, they did somehow make it. And some extremely bright people who just did not have opportunities. The second story of the school had to be added, and that, I think, was added around 1959. So the infants A and infants B occupied the top floor. And the lower level were the older boys. And by then, the school enrollment had to be adjusted for obvious reasons. They never had more than 100 kids until about after 1954. And the school teachers were social workers. I can tell you the names of the outstanding teachers of the school, headed by Mr. William Seymour Arthur, from of all places, Arthur St. Thomas. You know, you had Mr. Fitzgerald Downs, who was from Whitehall. He left Buxton, went to Montgomery as senior teacher, and then at Chalky Mount. I remember him telling me that after a year at Chalky Mount, I want you to look out for this bright young student. He's one of the brightest kids I've ever taught. He's coming to Harrison College. The young gentleman turned out to be Darcy Boyce. You know, and Darcy was one of those guys that went through Harrison College who probably never came lower than first in every exam or every class through school. But he was taught by Mr. Downs, who was an old Buxtonian. Then Mr. D.K. Dermot Lawrence from Cave Hill became very active with the Wesleyan Holiness Church when he retired from teaching. Wonderful man. And his boys all went to school. Malcolm, Willie, Michael, and the youngest brother, I'm trying to remember his name now, and the girls also, but most of them migrated. I think only Willie stayed in Barbados. And Roy was the youngest boy. And then We had Miss Lionel O'Brien, Ashton Lionel O'Brien Blackman. He was a colorful character, James Master, art master, craftsman, was in a regiment of the army, which Barbados had at the time. In World War II, he went to Egypt. I think he went to Egypt as a corporal or sergeant and came back as a private because he was a little indisciplined, but a character with some wonderful stories. Ended up leaving teaching around 1959 in Barbados. He moved to the Virgin Islands and he actually became a very senior official in the Department of Education in the U.S. Virgin Islands. From right there in Grisex, near the corner of Grisex and Tudor Bridge. His sister Merle died a few years ago. I think she might have reached 100, but he was a colorful character. And then there were some other young teachers who came and spent short times there. The late Walter Trotman, who at one stage was headmaster of Ellerslie, he taught there for a while. Cora Holder, the sister of Jean Holder, the late Jean Holder, and then Cora Walren, who went to Hinesbury. She taught as a young teacher there. But basically, that school was like a community center in the summer. Mr. Fitzgerald Downs, who later became headmaster not only at Chalky Mount, but at Roebuck. And then he decided to go into the priesthood like Reverend Frank Barker as a Moravian minister. But he used to run programs in the summer for the boys from Greenhill at Buxton School. We got a table tennis board built. So some very good players like Algie Motley, Stanley Medford, who was the senior education officer. We used to call him Bumstead, I think that was the nickname. Then he was my brother Neville, contemporary. Then they had Clevie Armstrong, and my brother Neville, and all of us learned to play table tennis in Buxton School. And then Mr. Lionel Blackman was very crafty, and we go into part of, there was a copse of trees that was owned by the Pilgrim family, and the mahogany. And so he would cut the mahogany and teach the kids how to make wall sconces from mahogany trees. And then they would paint them in bright colors and so forth and hook them up on the walls in the school and put flowers in them, etc. So there were many good teachers who taught us. Mr. Downs was very keen on agriculture and ran the vegetable gardens at the school. But then the garden was then taken when they built a proper latrine, as they call it, because they realized that the teachers had nowhere to go, especially when they started to have female teachers. So they used to come over to our house, you know, and so forth. But then they had the latrine that was built. There's a tree that's probably still on the grounds of Buxton School. That was planted around 1956 by Sir Mencia Cox, who was then the minister, I think, for housing and other things. You know, he planted that tree.
Now, if there were a Principal's Appreciation Day here in Barbados, there's absolutely no doubt that Michael King and the students of the Buxton Primary School would assemble here in the yard of Sharon Moravian Church, St. Thomas, annually to lay a wreath on the grave of William Seymour Arthur.
Mr. William Seymour Arthur, one of Barbados' best poets, and well respected in the Caribbean and as far as California and elsewhere, but not well known to Barbadians as a poet. But Mr. Arthur had a school magazine going in 1950 and 1951, and it gave updates about where the old boys were going to school, what they were doing, who was in the civil service, you know, who was teaching, who migrated, and then they had little short stories and poems written by students. Had a list of all the teachers. When Mr. Arthur retired in 1969, he would take the bus from Arthur Street to Bridgetown and then walk from down by Plantation Cemetery to the Fairchild Street bus stand and another bus to the Industry High School in St. Philip. And that's where he encountered people like Philip Pilgrim, who was a former judge of the industrial court in Antigua, my former deputy and colleague and dear friend David Bubulia, who is now a co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of West Indies at Cave Hill, and a gentleman called the most honorable Stetson Wiltshire, better known as Red Plastic Bag. In fact, Stetson told me that Mr. Arthur taught him how to break down a poem, talk about parsing and talk about meters and how to write poetry and so forth. David told me that were it not for Mr. Arthur, he would be nowhere. Mr. Arthur told his grandmother, with whom he lived, that he would like to have him for another year to prepare him for school. And David's one of the bright men I worked with in the Foreign Service, you know. But Mr. Arthur was a great teacher. How many people will you have expected to be producing a school magazine in 1950, 1951? And those Buxton kids remain loyal to their teachers. You go anywhere in the world and you meet them. In fact, when we were preparing for the Washington Conference on the Caribbean in 2007, my mission in Washington, the Embassy of Barbados, had a responsibility for preparing the component with the diaspora. So we had to go all over the U.S., major cities, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Southern Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Connecticut, Hartford area, Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Houston. And David went with me. He was the go-to person. And he could not believe it. He said that everywhere he went, he met somebody who was from Green Hill, who went to school at Buxton or played cricket with me at Imperial Harrison College. I told him, well, you know, I just had great experiences in life. And, but it was amazing to see people who remain closely connected to that school. And Mr. Arthur, who lived to 102.
It's a milestone that not everyone achieves, but it's not so with William Seymour Arthur, who celebrated his birthday today at Arthur Seat in St. Thomas. Members of his family, friends and people from the neighborhood attended the ceremony, as well as His Excellency Sir Clifford Husbands, the Governor-General, who paid tribute to the 100-year-old man. William Arthur dedicated 62 years to the teaching service and taught for 44 years in the government service, then as administrator of the Industry High School. One of his daughters describes him as an excellent father, very kind-hearted and tender, stricter at school than at home. But the father of 7 was also a writer, a poet, a journalist, and even once read several short stories on the BBC.
He wrote 3 book of poems. Whispers of the Dawn in 1941, Morning Glory in 1944, No Idle Winds in 1955. He was also the founder of a Pen Pal Associate Friendship Club, and editor of the Cosmos magazine. He liked a lot of writing. And at his Pen Pal Club, he encouraged people to correspond with each other.
Well done, William. Happy birthday.
And died in January 2012.
A notable Barbadian writer and educator who died at the age of 102 has been laid to rest. He was William Seymour Arthur, who was headmaster of Buxton's Boys' School, journalist with the Herald newspaper, and author of 3 volumes of poetry. Family, friends, and colleagues paid their final respects at Sharon Moravian Church today.
He was a wonderful teacher. Tough, you know, but soft-spoken, gentle.
In a previous episode of My Community, Everton Brown of St. Philip spoke of his experiences during the passage of Hurricane Janet while he was a student at the Urdiston Teachers Training College. Young Michael King remembers Hurricane Janet, but more specifically the role played by the school in the aftermath of its passage. You will also note the generosity of his mother, who understood her position in the community and played her part.
I have memories of Hurricane Janet in September 1955, where Buxton School was a shelter for many people in the community who lost their humble homes. And the housing stock in those days was not the best that you can think of. And I remember going over and playing with the kids, who were obviously schoolmates, during the day. I remember the people who lived in our house for several weeks and slept on the floor or shared beds or whatever were available. I also remember my mother cooking and sending food over to the shelter to people. But my fondest memory was that night. You will hear all the talking, because we were close enough to Buxton, and all the chatter and so at night, and people having fun. And then around 9 o'clock every night, there was a gentleman from Story Gap, Codrington Hill. His name was Kid Fork. Kid Fork had a baritone saxophone, and every night he would play "Oh Danny Boy," and then there will be a stillness in the air and not a sound until about 6 o'clock in the morning. Everybody went to bed.
That, of course, underscores the importance of a community school. Well, that is where we end this week's edition of My Community Greenhill, featuring Michael King, a presentation that highlights the importance of memory to mankind and its role in helping us to understand ourselves and our communities. Thank you very much, Mr. King. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Please be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbours. The program continues next week at the same time.